Okay, so we're up to chapter 29. In this chapter, so Yaakov has had his dream and he made his vow, and he sets out in chapter 29 to walk to Haran, or Aram, as his father called it. And the first pasuk says he goes out to Bnei Kedem. We talked about that, going to the east. Now we have Yaakov is about to come to Haran. So let's pick up with the second pasuk. Vayar v'nei be'er basadeh, v'hinei sham shlosha edrei tzon ropsim oleha, ki min ha'be'er hahi yashku ha'adarim, v'ya'evin gedolah al pi ha'be'er. So we have, he comes, and the first thing he sees in the field is a well, a be'er, and he sees, we are told, 3 edrei tzon, 3 flocks of sheep who are lying there beside it. For from that well, they would give the flocks of sheep water to drink. And on top of this well is a rock. It means that it's closed. No one is permitted to take it, to get the water. As it says in the next pasuk, so literally the flocks would gather there, and they would, presumably the shepherds would, roll the stone off the well, top of the well, and give water to the flock, sheep, and they would return, they would restore, they would return the rock to the top of the well. Presumably, the reason, actually not just presumably, later on Yaakov comes there, Yaakov asks them, what's going on over here? Why are you people standing around? Why don't you get the water from the well and take care of the sheep? That's in verse number 7 is the question. And in verse number 8, they respond. It says, Vayomru lo nuchal. We can't move the rock off the top of the well until all of the flocks have arrived. So we have to wait until all of the flocks have come. So presumably, the reason for this is that they wait till all of them come, so nobody will take the water before the other shepherds come with their flocks. So that's the rule. The rule makes a fair amount of sense. We don't want people just coming and taking before the others. This way, all the different flocks presumably have an equal opportunity to take water from the well. That's the rule of the shepherds, one might say. That's their common practice. So Yaakov doesn't know that yet, but he comes to this well, and on top of the well, there's a rock. So the first thing we actually notice 2 things over here, I think, at least. First thing we notice is that Yaakov's initial encounter after leaving Beersheba, the place of his dream, he comes to a well. And we remember that earlier in the Chumash, we have encountered wells. We encountered wells, of course. We encountered a well with the story of Rivka, when the servant when Avram sent his servant to find a wife for Yitzchak. So the servant goes, sort of parks the donkeys, back in chapter 24, and he goes, he goes to a well. At the time, we ate Erev, we ate Seta Shoavot, towards evening, when the women drawing water would come out. So we encountered a well, and that story of the well, of course, that was the setting for the ultimate marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka. And we have also encountered wells in the chapter 25. Yitzchak digs wells. Avram had dug wells. Yitzchak digs up the same wells. Yitzchak digs other wells. We have seen that also. And in point of fact, the very last story that we saw. Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheba. Yaakov leaves from Beersheba. Beersheba, the well, Beersheba actually is named twice. It's named for the oath that they took, Abraham and Yitzchak and Avimelech, and you have it also with Abraham, 7 kvasot that he sets aside. Sheva kvasot tikach miyadi. You have. So the story that we just encountered, the last story, is about Beersheba, and it's about an Evan. Yaakov has a stone he puts under his head. Yaakov takes the stone erects the stone as a pillar. Yaakov promises that this Evan shall become the house of God. So the theme of the rock, the theme of the stone, Yaakov promises to build. He names the place Beit El, God's house. I promise, says Yaakov, if I return safely, when I return safely, to build God's house. And that all takes place at Beersheba. And now the next story, the first story actually, is all about rocks and wells. So there's obviously some link between the two stories. We'll get to this later on about what the possible links could be between the two stories. But clearly there are links to this story, and there's also going to be a link to the other story of Rebecca at the well. Namely, it's going to be the well is in that story and this one, and the story of Moshe later on at the beginning of the book of Shemot. It's the setting for marriage. Marriage of Rivka to Yitzchak, marriage of Yaakov to Rachel, marriage of Moshe to Tzipporah. All those 3 stories are related to a well. There are 3 different kinds of marriages, 3 different stories, but the Torah links them clearly. So this is what we come to now. Meanwhile, Yaakov comes here. Something is actually very interesting here about this verse. That is, Shosha Edrei Son Rotzi Moel, verse number 2. And that is, Edrei Son are flocks of sheep. What's curious is that it doesn't say what you would expect it to say, and gathered there are shepherds with their flocks. That's what you expect to see. Because obviously there's shepherds there, since it says, they would wait till everybody would come and they would roll the rock off the top of the well. Well, the sheep aren't rolling the rock off the well, the shepherds are, presumably. So obviously, we're talking about what Yaakov sees here, presumably, are the shepherds with their flocks. So it is very curious that the Chumash doesn't mention the shepherds. The Chumash only mentions the flocks, the sheep. And the question is, what, if anything, are we to make of this? Can we make anything of this? Should we make anything of this? And I suspect that yes, we should, because the point of this description, namely, it's a place where the sheep gather, is it raises, and there's no mention of the shepherds, not at this point. And what it raises is the question of this place that Yaakov comes to. What is this place actually about? Is it about the people that live there? Or is it about the possessions that are there? And we'll get to this later on. This is a very central point. So the first thing we encounter are sheep. Adorim are sheep. Here's Yaakov. So Yaakov comes here. And now Yaakov begins to question. He's on the journey towards Haran. He doesn't necessarily know exactly where he is. So Yaakov, now in the 4th pasuk, has questions. Vayomer lahem Yaakov. So Yaakov speaks to them. Now we discover there are people. We didn't know that. We thought they were just flocks of sheep. Vayomer lahem Yaakov achai, calls them my brothers. Me'ayin atem, where are you from? You've gathered at the well. What town are you coming from? Vayomu mecharan anachnu. We are from Haran. This is his destination. Vayomu lahem, hayidatem et Lavan ben Nachar. You're from Haran. Do you know Lavan, the son of Nachar? Of course, Lavan is actually not the son of Nachar. Lavan is the son of Betuel. We know that. But Nachar doesn't mean he's the son of Nachar, but Nachar apparently is the important person over here. And later on in the story, much later, Nachar will figure again. And Nachar, of course, is Avram's brother. And the genealogy of Nachor is found in the Chumash right after the Akedah, where the Torah singles out Rivka. She's part of that family. So Yaakov speaks of Lavan. Do you know Lavan? Nachor's descendant, literally the son, descendant of Nachor. Vayamru Yadanu. We know him. We know him. Vayamu lahem hashalom lo. And he said to them, is he well? Literally, peace. Is he well? Vayamu shalom. They said, peace. V'hinei Rachel bito ba'a im hatzon. And behold, Rachel, his daughter, comes with the flock. So just for a moment to reflect on this, I would say conversation, but it's a funny kind of conversation. Because one of the two partners in conversation has very few words. In fact, you can't have too few words. The first response is two words, Bechavan anachnu. The second verse is Yodanu, one word. And the third is Shalom. They're not exactly loquacious. They say very little. One can wonder why. They say very little. But they say, but behold, we'll tell you something that you didn't ask. Rachel bito ba'a imatzon. Rachel, his daughter, comes with the flock. So what to make of their, brevity, one could say. What does that mean? Hard to know. And again, when you're reading the Chumash, what we don't have is we can't hear it. We see the words, we don't hear them. Do you know Lavan? Yadanu. We know him. Is that what they said? Or did they say, we know him? That's very different, Oh, we know him, all right. So we don't know. We're going to find out who Lavan is. Lavan makes the story very interesting. Lavan is a wonderful character. So when it comes to Lavan, they're not saying much. But Rachel, oh, look, there's Rachel, his daughter. They seem more enthusiastic when it comes to Rachel. And now we hear this little expression, B'nei Rachel bito ba'a im hatzon. So here's what's interesting. Her name is Rachel. Rachel is a U, right? E-W-E. Rachel comes with the tzon. So there's something interesting. She's coming with the tzon, with the flock, but her name is Rachel. One might say a member of the flock. And that's a very important insight, and we'll see how this plays out in the story. So we'll see. Yes, Debbie, you had a question? Yes, is there a question there? Someone has a question.
It seemed to me that they don't want to engage. He hasn't seen people in a while, and he's hungry for human contact, is how I always looked at it. And he talks to them, hello, do you know? And they don't want to engage with him at all. So they sort of dispense with him with a one word. And then they say, but, if you really want to talk, there's Rachel, like they foist him on her.
Oh, you're saying that they say, Rachel, if you have questions about the family, you can ask her. That's possible.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know. He wants information. He wants to know where he is. He was sent to Haran.
Right.
And I guess they don't have, very good signs up on the roads as to where Haran is. So he simply wants information. It's true. They seem to have very little interest in engaging with him altogether. That's for sure. Not interested. Does it say something about them in terms of how they see the other, the outsider, the stranger, or not? I'm not sure about that. We'll get to this business of Rachel ba'im hatzon in 1 minute. Is there any other question over here?
Yeah, their anonymity or their reminds me of the depiction of Bnei Yisrael at the beginning of Shemot, where they're people who have no names.
Right. It's not about.
They just have a function, and they're subordinate to the property.
Right. But those are two different things. Having no name in the beginning of Shemot means having no identity. My point is not
That's
that
that's exactly,
they're not mentioned altogether. They're simply not mentioned. In other words, we forget names. He's walking and he sees shepherds with flocks. He's going to talk to the people. So what is striking is that the Chumash talks about the Adorim. That's my point. It doesn't mention people altogether. When you first encounter it, you would think it's just the sheep have wandered over to a well on their own. Animals are drawn to water, right? Right? That the heart pants after the water in Tehillim. The point is, there are people, he talks to them. But my point is what the Chumash is setting up is wants us to think about Haran in general, how we view people versus property. That's going to be a very central question in the story. One of the central issues in Yaakov's sojourn in the house of Lavan, or the culture of Lavan, is how Lavan sees human beings and how Lavan sees people. That's very central because how does Yaakov see him? That's very basic to us. We'll get to this. It plays out very nicely. Anybody else? Wendy, you had something to say?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Oh, hey, thanks. I just want to make sure I got this right. Okay, so in other words, when you're saying that when the Chumash begins to describing Yaakov arriving at this place, they're talking about the flocks, and it's only later that we realize, wait, there are shepherds there also. And then they begin to converse, but they're very brief in their replies to Yaakov's questions. Yes, we're from Haran. Yes, we do. And if that's all correct, then I wondered, why is it that? But when Yaakov asks about Laban, they go more into depth and say, yes, he's not only well, but there is his daughter Rachel coming with the flock. Why do they elaborate at that point? Is that to just get her started in the story, or?
Well, right. We need to know that it's Rachel for sure. My point is, I just was observing. What we'll make of this, we'll see. Maybe it's not as terribly significant. My point is, are they being dismissive of him? It could be. Or is it, they didn't really want to say much about Lavan. When it comes to Lavan, they have one-word answers. We know him. He's okay. They're not interested in Lavan. And I think for the reader, I think it raises a question. We already encountered Lavan earlier in chapter 24 in the marriage of Rivka to Yitzchak. And there already, he's a dubious character. But the question is, but he wasn't a central character. Here, he's going to be a central character in the story, as we'll see. So what the Chumash does often is it creates expectations, it drops hints, and then later on, we'll get a fuller picture of who Lavan is. But all we can say is when it comes to talking about Lavan, they're not very interested. But his daughter's another story, and behold, look, there's his daughter coming. So it could be, say, talk to her, not us. That's possible. Or it could be a way of saying, when it comes to her, she's okay, But when it comes to Lavan, the less said, the better. I'm just raising it as a possibility. And we'll see as the story proceeds. We'll see what we'll see this in a moment. But if the focus is always going to be Yaakov, of course. So now Yaakov speaks to them. Vayomer hein od hayom gadol. Lo ete yosef hamikneh hashku hatzon uluchureu. Yaakov says, look, it's the day is it's still daylight. Apparently, it's not necessarily at nighttime when the women came out in chapter 24. They came out at twilight. But here he says it's still day. Why don't you go and do your job? He says, go out and tend to the sheep. What are you standing around here? What is this? A 3-hour lunch break or something? And it's interesting. Why does Yaakov say that? Does he say it because it actually bothers him that people aren't working? We'll see later on. He's a very industrious worker. Yaakov works very hard. He says that about himself, and it sounds true. He is a very, very diligent worker. So it bothers him. People are just sloughing off and not doing their job. Is that the reason? Or maybe the reason is he wants to speak to Rachel alone, doesn't want anybody else around. That's also a possibility. After all, he came to marry one of Lavan's daughters. They didn't say which one. Go to my brother. He has daughters. They get married. That's what Rivka said, and that's basically what Yitzchak says. Go and take a wife. Yitzchak says it explicitly. Take a wife from one of the daughters of Lavan. And here, what do you know? He's barely there, and Rachel shows up. It's amazing. One might say in the words of chapter 24, May Hashem Yatzah Davar. What a fortuitous coincidence that he dafka meets Rachel even before he gets there. So maybe he wants to get rid of them. Hey guys, go do. That's another possibility. But we'll see all these things later on in terms of Yaakov's character, as it is reflected in the stories of Yaakov in the house of Lavan. But they say to him, "Lo nucha, we can't." As I said before, we can't go to. We have to wait till all of the flocks literally come, and then they roll the rock off the top of the well, and we give the sheep water. The shtinu atzon. So we have to wait. That's how we're not allowed to do anything till everybody shows up. Odenu medaber imam. They're still speaking. And Rachel comes with the father's flock, for she is a shepherd. So Rachel is a shepherd. Fine. So now she's come. She was approaching. She was Ba'ah, and now Ba'ah. She actually has arrived. And now we have the following verse. So when Yaakov sees Rachel, the daughter of Lavan, his mother's brother, V'yetzon Lavan achi imo, and the sheep of the flock of Lavan, his mother's brother, Vayigash Yaakov comes forward, Vayagu eto even me'api aber, he rolls the rock off the top of the well, Vayash Getzon Lavan achi imo, and he gives water to the flock of Lavan, his mother's brother. Vayishak Yaakov Rachel, and Yaakov kisses Rachel. Vayisad kolo vayev, and he raises his voice, lifts up his voice, and he cries. And now let's look at these two verses over here and what they say. First thing that strikes us, of course, is the 3-time mention of Lavan achi imo. He sees Rachel, the daughter of Lavan, his mother's brother. He sees the flock of Lavan, his mother's brother. He rolls the rock off the well, and he gives water to the flock of Lavan, his mother's brother. 3 times Lavan, his mother's brother, and that's where he was sent to find a wife. So the Torah reminds us that, and it's taking place at a well, no less. So it reminds us that his mission, apart from escaping, was to get a wife, and from a particular family. And here she is. Here she is, the first person he meets. It's got to be, it's bashert, as we say. This has got to be it. Now, there's more to this, I believe, but I want to make a different point. And that is that what the verse says the following: Jacob saw, Ra'ah Yaakov. What does he see? He sees Rachel, the daughter of Lavan, and he sees the flock. So Jacob sees 2 things. He sees Rachel, and he sees the flock. Of course, the word Rachel, the ewe, is also part of a flock, right? It's also an animal, a Rachel. And then what does Jacob do? When it comes to Rachel, Vayishak Yaakov Rachel, he kisses Rachel. And when it comes to the animals, Vayash, he gives them to drink. It is in the written text exactly the same word. Vayishak and Vayash. It's exactly the same word. And that raises the following question for us. What is Yaakov really seeing over here? Because he's seeing 2 different things. Is he seeing his prospective wife? Is that what he's fundamentally seeing? Her name is Rachel. Or is he fundamentally seeing the flocks? Which of these 2 is he seeing? And what complicates matters is that Rachel, the name Rachel itself, is part of a flock. And this raises a very basic question. In other words, the culture to which Yaakov is entering, into which he enters, culture of Lavan, is a culture, I'll say it at this point, and it's clear, It's a culture in which everything is for sale. That's what actually Lavan's daughters say about him, say about Lavan. When Yaakov later on in the story says, God appeared to me in a dream and told me to leave, and he talks to his two wives in the field, and they say, why shouldn't we leave? In chapter 31, he treats us like foreign women whom he sells, and he devoured all of our money. So for Lavan, as we'll see, everything is for sale. It's all about business, basically. And now that's true of Lavan. And that's the culture in which Yaakov is going to enter. But the question we have is, we don't care about Lavan. Lavan is Lavan, but the question is Yaakov. How does Yaakov understand family versus business? After all, he did buy a birthright for a bowl of soup. He got his brother to sell him a birthright. So what is that about? And now with these verses, it's unclear. What is he saying? Is primarily seeing Rachel, or is primarily seeing the flocks of Lavan, son Lavan? One of them Vayash, and the other Vayisha. The Chumash is not answering this question at this point. The Chumash is raising it as a question, just as it does with the Adarim. It doesn't mention the shepherds. It's a place where, as I said, from Lavan's perspective, everything is for sale. And the question is to what extent Yaakov will buy into that, and to what extent Yaakov will say, that's not my way. I distinguish family from business. Business is one thing. Personal relationship is something very different. So I just raise this as a big question. And the question will become much more clear later on when we get into the story of Yaakov and Rachel and Lavan. Then it becomes a genuine question and a genuine problem, I believe. But okay, let me stop you for a moment. If there are any comments or questions now, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, yes. I have one. I mean, I always thought of this, maybe I even heard it from you, I don't know. I always thought of this as a very romantic sort of thing. I mean, first of all, when it says we have to wait for all the shepherds to come, I assume that meant they need them all in order to take the rock off the thing. So,
yes.
But there Jacob is showing an incredible amount of power in doing it himself. And then he's kissing her, and then he's crying. I mean, crying is not something, a business proposition. So
right.
Even if the kissing is the same word as the, so maybe they're just telling two stories at the same time, but it seems like they are saying a very romantic thing. And of course, we know he's in love with her later. So it seems like
I agree. Can I jump in and ask a question too?
Go ahead.
Because
I don't disagree with you, by the way. I agree.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I look forward to hearing more of the explanation, but it seems to me that he is deeply emotional. He's falling in love. You're seeing a man fall in love. And what the question then becomes is, can love in the Bible, is it really the precondition for chosenness? Because it really subverts the paradigm of the eldest. And instead of the primogenitor, it's about love, right? So Rebecca loved Jacob. He got the birthright. Jacob loves Rachel. She becomes the favorite. And that really becomes part of the covenant. It's a really interesting way of understanding human relations, perhaps. Anyway, that's my question.
Look, my point is not that we have an emotional scene, both the kissing and also the crying. I'll get back to the emotional scene. I don't mean to suggest he's just a cold-blooded guy who always making calculations. But my point is that these two things, the calculating person on one hand and the highly emotional person on the other, those two things can reside very nicely in the same person. The person that actually resides in the deepest possible way is the King David of the book of Samuel. And you actually never know with David, almost never, why he does what he does. You can always explain it in any number of ways. Is it a calculation? Is it real? The fact of the matter is, David is a poet. David is a deeply emotional person, and you see that on several occasions, even at risk of his own life. At the same time, David is a calculating person, And the truth is, one of the powers of the book of Shmuel is you really can't tell often which of those two predominate. They're both there at all points. And my point is that with Yaakov, we saw this earlier. He is a calculating guy. He didn't happen to be preparing supper when Esav comes home from the field. It's not happens. Vayazed Yaakov Nazid. It wasn't B'shogeg. It was B'mezid. He knows when he comes back. He knows his brother very well. He knows how he's going to behave. That doesn't mean that the birthright and the blessing are that which Esav should be getting. I'm not suggesting that. But there is a calculating side to Yaakov. So all my point over here is not to suggest that it's not emotional. Now, whether love, as you would call it over here, love at first sight, is for the book of Breshit a firm foundation for marriage, that's a very good question. One could easily make the argument that it's not, given the fact that there are three patriarchs have three marriages. One of them is pretty solid, which is Isaac and Rebecca. Yes, they don't communicate, but there's a deep mutual respect there. And Isaac actually loves Rebecca. He prays for Rebecca, he prays for her to have children. Even though he himself has no children, he prays for her. When it comes to Yaakov and Rachel, as we will see soon, it doesn't take long for Yaakov to get angry at Rachel and Rachel to get angry at Yaakov. So again, we'll see all these things. The beauty of it is it's very complicated, and as human beings tend to be. So yes, there is an emotional side, and what is the basis of the emotion is a good question, because the Torah emphasizes. I fixated on love on it, but the fact of the matter is, 3 times in the verse it mentions Rebecca. He sees the flock of love on his mother's brother. 3 times his mother's brother. So one can say over here, without getting too psychoanalytic, that in point of fact, what the Chumash seems to be suggesting here is, I don't mean in a Freudian sense, what the Chumash seems to be suggesting is that Rachel will take the place of his mother. It is striking that whereas Rebecca said to Yaakov, I will call you back in a few days, she never calls him back. This is the last we've heard of Rivka. We hear that Rivka has died, but we don't have Rivka in any more stories. So there's a sense over here, sorry for the reader, that this is the last of Rivka. Rivka is not going to call him back. God already said to Yaakov on the way out, I'm going to bring you back. His mother had said, I'll call for you in a few days. I'll bring you back. Doesn't happen, won't happen. So is the crying over here, fundamentally the question is the crying over here a crying of joy? People cry out of joy. Or is it a crying primarily that of sadness? And the fact of the matter is that you can read it both ways. You can read it as a kind of emotional response upon meeting it is the one who he thinks may become his life partner. That's certainly possible. But you can also read it the other way, namely that as long as he's traveling, he's on the road, he hasn't really left home. But the moment he actually arrives at the place, when he arrives at his destination, that's the point in time where you realize he's not home anymore. And as we discussed last week, it's not going to be a simple matter to get home. So that could be that the crying is the fact that he won't be home with the one who loved him, which was his mother, Rivka Hevedet Yaakov. And not only that, Vayisad Kolo Vayev reminds the reader of chapter 27. That's what Esav did. When Esav learned that Yaakov has taken his blessing, twice the Torah mentions that Esav cried, Vayisad Kolo Vayev. And in point of fact, it's the very taking of that blessing which causes Jacob or forces Jacob to leave home. So therefore, the crying is not necessarily one of joy. The crying could be one of sadness or wistfulness as well. That is point number one. In terms of the Midrashim, it's very interesting that the Medrash adds another level, and that is the Medrash sees the crying as related to Yaakov meeting Rachel. And Rashi quotes a Medrash. He sees Rachel and he cries. And the Medrash has, I believe, 2 different possible reasons why. One is he prophesies that he won't be buried with her. he won't be buried with her. And what does that medrash mean? We want to understand the medrash.
Right.
What is it trying to say over here? What do you mean he won't be buried with her? He meets her, he kisses her, and he cries. He won't be buried with her. And here the medrash is, I think, anticipating for us a very basic point about Rachel, which is that actually Yaakov and Rachel is very problematic. On one hand, they have a lot in common, and he falls in love with her right away. But on the other hand, the character of Rachel, at least in the Chumash, in this chapter, in Sefer Bereshit, is a very problematic side to Rachel. I mean, why isn't Jacob buried with Rachel? Well, why not? Why are Jacob and Rachel not buried together? It's his beloved wife. And the answer is because Rachel will steal her father's idols. And because of that, she will die in childbirth before she fully makes it back. That's the reason they're not buried together. Yaakov's returning to Beit El, and Rachel has Trophim. In point of fact, what the Medrash is getting at is sometimes you can fall in love with somebody, but actually that relationship is going to be problematic because you're not exactly on the same wavelength, because there are certain marked differences which create kind of friction, or you recognize maybe this can't really be my true soulmate. These things have to be worked out. So it's not just he prophesized, there's a reason for it. And in point of fact, when you look at the story over here, you already see something very interesting, because the story over here, the way the Chumash works is one story recalls another, or one story recalls many. You read the story of a well and a marriage scene at a well, which is what this is. And you remember the first marriage scene at the well. The first marriage scene at the well, Isaac's not there, but the messenger creates a test. What is the test? The test is a test of one's morality, compassion, greeting the stranger, greeting the outsider, the way you behave, and Rebecca passes the test. Not only does she do more for the stranger than he asked for, she feeds his camels, waters the camels, that's a lot of water, but she also does it, the Chumash says, Batmaher, she does it in a hurried manner. She's quick to do it. In short, greeting the stranger and doing so in a rushing to do good, rushing to greet the guest. Of course, the one who exemplifies that in the Torah to this point is none other than Avraham. That's what Avraham does when guests come to his house. So Rivka is acting as an Abraham figure. Now Avraham sends the servant to find somebody like himself who's willing to leave her home and travel far away because she sees it as her destiny, her mission. And Rebecca is exactly that. So there's no mention of love in the story. How could she fall in love with Isaac? She's never seen him. He's not even there. It's not about love. It's about morality as the basis of marriage. That's what that story is about. And she passes the test 100%. Over here, what's striking over here is that it's not that Rachel gives Yaakov's flocks water. Yaakov has no flocks. But the point of fact, it's exactly the opposite. By Yashket Son Lavan Achi Imo, he gives water to the flocks of Rachel, which is very lovely. But in point of fact, when you read the story here, it doesn't say anything negative about Rachel, of course, but it also doesn't say anything positive either. In other words, it's precisely the opposite. Whereas in the first story, her giving his camels to drink is the sign of her high moral standard, her high level of behavior. What we can say over here is we have no evidence one way or the other about her behavior, zero, nothing negative, but nothing positive either. And there's something else in the story, namely that when it came to Rachel, at the well, the servant gives Rachel the bracelet, etc., the jewelry, as a sign that he's designating her for Yitzchak. And then back in chapter 24, what does Rivka do? In chapter 24, it says, in chapter 24, Rebecca runs and informs her mother's house, Beit Imah. She runs to her mother. But over here in chapter 29, after Yaakov gives Rachel Rachel's flock the water, kisses her, he cries, very emotional. And Yaakov tells Rachel that he is related to her. That's in verse number 32. Ki achi aviyahu v'chi ben Rivkahu. He's a cousin. V'ataratz v'taged li aviyah, and she runs and tells her father. She goes to Lavan. And right away, there's a difference here. When it comes to Rivka, she doesn't run to the father's house. She tells her mother. When it comes to Rachel, she tells her father. Now, the question is that distinction, obviously, it's different. What do we make of the distinction? Here's what I make of it. What I make of it is this. When it comes to the carriers of the tradition in the book of Genesis are the men. It's a patriarchal book. The women have all kinds of insight. When it comes to blessing the children, the father blesses his son. That's the way the book works. The father represents the culture. When it comes to Rivka, she doesn't go to her father. She goes to her mother. And the point of that is, Rivka is a young person who, from the very beginning, is not bound up with the values and the culture and the connections to a particular family. And that precipitates what Rivka is able to do in the story, which is to leave. At the end of the day, the family wants to hold on to Rivka, and the servant said, "I got to go. Let's see what the little girl wants. Rivka, will you go with this man? Batomer elech, I will go," which is actually the test over there. Is she willing to go? And she is willing to go. Against what the family clearly wants, she says, "I'm going." When it comes to Rachel, that's not true. When it comes to Rachel, she is tied in to her father. And the Chumash, of course, precipitates what's going to happen later on. When Rachel leaves, we'll get to that later on, when Rachel will leave the house of her father, she takes something of her father with her. She has her reasons for it, but she takes something of her father with her, namely his idols. In other words, when it comes to Rachel, there's a deep connection, much deeper than Rivka, to the place from which she is coming. When it comes to Rivka, that's not the case. Rivka is able to break away, to leave, to take that long journey, the Abraham journey, I would call it. But even from the very beginning, you get a sense, she doesn't go to the father. So there's already a kind of very attenuated link between Rivka and the place from which she comes. That's not true of Rachel. That's what the Medrash is getting at. He saw he wouldn't be buried with her. Their relationship is much more complex in that sense, because Rachel is, the issue with Yaakov is going to be, can he break away from Lavan? It's not going to be simple to leave Lavan. We know that already. God said, "I'm going to protect you." He goes out to Bnei Kedem. We talked about all that. And the question is, how difficult it will be for him to leave, how difficult it will be for her to leave. We'll see later on that the Torah sets up these two tracks, two parallel tracks. And I believe that's what the Medrash is getting at. He cries because he realizes he wouldn't be buried with her. She's not buried with him, but there's a reason for that. And that actually sets up the whole story of Yaakov and Rachel in Sefer Bereshit. Many years ago, Leon Cass came in and he gave her two classes. When he had him come in, he gave two classes on Genesis. They're pretty good. One was on Rebecca and one was on Rachel. So afterwards, I spoke to him. I said, I like what he said about Rebecca. But when it came to Rachel, I think I would raise the following question. You ended your story when Rachel dies, chapter 35. I said, in truth, the story doesn't end when Rachel dies. One might say the story begins when Rachel dies. Because after Rachel dies, Yaakov sets out to make sure that Rachel is incorporated into the Jewish people. And the way he does that is most interesting. We'll get to that, hopefully. It's a very important point. But how Yaakov does it, what Yaakov does, how Yaakov interprets Rachel, one might say. Yaakov's a great interpreter of his own life and the people around him. So he has a very interesting interpretation of Rachel. But we'll see all this later. My point is a different point. My point's about reading the text. My point is that these questions are anticipated by the text. The way texts work is they set up expectations. Anybody who reads this is thinking, I wonder, Vayashkin Vayishak, I wonder about that. I wonder about the crying. And we don't have to have answers at this point. We have no answers because the Chumash doesn't want to give us answers. the Chumash is intending to give us questions. And then when we read later on, we will see how this develops. It tends to be complicated. It's not one or the other. It's not that he necessarily cries out of joy or out of sadness. That's not the way the Chumash works. I mean, maybe that's okay if you study it in 3rd or 4th grade, maybe so. When you get beyond that, though, you're dealing with human beings and the complexity of what it means to be human. And sometimes you simply can't tell, actually. You simply cannot tell. Is it a calculation? Is it a deep feeling? There's always, King David is the best example of it. You never know almost never, with rare occasions, you don't know what primarily motivates David. Can't know that in Sefer Shmuel. And here, of course, similarly with Yaakov, it's a question. Yes, because he sees Rachel, he's very taken with her. Seems like he's met the one he's destined to marry. But that's not to say that in the back of his head, he's not thinking about the flocks as well. Given his past history, it would not surprise us. Okay, let me take.
I have a comment, if I may.
Yeah.
Yes.
That when I'm reading the story of Jacob, I'm always asking about his transformation from the Akuv, the Arum, to Israel.
Yes.
And because you mentioned two things, the flock and the stone, the Evan, it occurred to me another way of reading all this is that he's beginning to notice and to be committed to the flock, which could be Bnei Israel, a metaphor for Bnei Israel. And because of his dream, the Evan gives him the ability to move the Evan that the shepherds weren't able to, and the motivation to do that. So his focus, in addition to the love story with Rachel, it's the beginning of the awareness of the flock, that could be significant.
Well, let's put it this way. I'm not sure about the flock being Bnei Israel. If you mean Bnei Israel and his children, the story of Jacob is not at this point about the people Israel.
No, I mean the process of going there at the beginning.
Right. Look, the point is he has to go there for any number of reasons. He has to go there, as we spoke, because he's got to run away, which is a punishment. But he has to go there to build the family. He says it himself, I'm going to build a bayit, which means for Yaakov, his family. He calls his family a bayit on 2 different occasions. And this is going to be the issue. How do you build? The theme of the rock is all about building. Jacob will build the family. Jacob will have 12 sons who end up blessing all 12. The question is, how will Jacob manage to build this family? And there we have all the complications of the house of Laban. And the fact is, my point is, it's not just about Jacob wants to do only the right thing, and you have Laban as an obstacle. Laban is certainly an obstacle. But the danger of Laban is not an external obstacle to Jacob. The danger of Laban, the real danger, is that there's a part of Jacob that fits in very nicely with Laban. Laban is an arch deceiver. He's a Ramai. Jacob did plenty of deception himself. The danger of Laban is that he'll bring out the worst in Jacob. Jacob has to overcome that. That's what the story is actually about. And the way the family gets built, because of the circumstances, because of Laban, because he's building it there, you're going to end up with a family in which there are deep divisions within his own family. And part of that is Jacob. Jacob favors Rachel. Jacob favors Joseph. It's not something which is just happenstance. The problems that happen to Yaakov are essentially emerging from Yaakov's fundamental behavior and his fundamental nature. That's the point. And we will see this later. There's no point to say it all now. The Chumash will take us on a journey, and maybe we'll see many things that we've never seen before, myself included. You never know when you read this. It's so complicated. But my point is that the way great texts work, in the case of the Chumash, is by creating possibilities in your head. And then we'll see how it plays out.
Rabbi?
We'll see how it plays out. Okay,
Rabbi?
let me do a little
Rabbi?
bit more here. I'll take one more time to take more comments and questions. Yaakov sets out. Fine. So now,
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Sandra, do you see a connection with the dreamer Jacob, whom we saw last week, and the crier Jacob, whom we see this week? There's a direct parallel to Joseph later on. A primary, we tend to think of Joseph as the dreamer, and then of course he cries numerous times chapters later in Egypt. So is the Chumash hinting to us there's more here in terms of his ability and his necessity, almost primal necessity, to favor that son later on? We're seeing now some of those qualities that he is going to see in this son that he favors.
For sure. I mean, there's no question. Eila Toldot Yaakov Yosef. It's clear that Yosef and Yaakov have much in common. There's also important differences between them. But the fact is, we'll have to wait till we get to Yosef. But there's no doubt that both in terms of the crying, Yosef cries at least 4 times, and they both are dreamers. That's true. Yaakov is a dreamer. Yosef is a dreamer. Yosef's also an interpreter of his dreams, and we'll have to see whether Yaakov is an interpreter of his own dreams or not. It's a very good question. But we'll get to all these things later. Let's just move forward a bit, and then I'll take at the end 5 minutes for more comments and questions. Okay, so meanwhile, right, we're up to here. Yaakov kisses Rachel, he cries. Then Yaakov tells Rachel, in verse number 12, he tells her who he is. And she informs her father. I talked about that. She goes to her father. And now Lavan. Vayikishmo Lavan et Shema Yaakov ben Achoto, Vayaratz likrato, Vayichabek lo, Vayinashek lo, Vayiviyeu el beito. So Lavan rushes out to greet his nephew. He rushes out to greet him. He hugs him. He kisses him. He brings him into his house. Great enthusiasm. And then, Vayisaper Lavan et kol hadvarim ha'ela. And Jacob told Lavan all of these things. The Chumash doesn't tell us what he told him. It seems to be more than, my name is Jacob and I'm your sister's son. Did he tell him all of these things? Did he tell him, why am I here? Why am I here? He's here because he has to run away from home. And apparently he's here, unlike the first instance where the servant came with 10 camels laden with all kinds of goodies, as the Mefarshim all point out. He comes, it would appear, with basically next to nothing. Doesn't seem to have anything with him. So you may think the Medrash says, sarcastically, I would say he's kissing and hugging Yaakov and searching for the jewels. He doesn't have camels, maybe he has diamonds, maybe they're in his mouth. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but the idea that Lavan is fueled by potential gain is hardly an exaggeration, right? We see that in the first story as well. So then when he first comes, what do you know? This is who knows what's going to be? Who knows what if the servant came with 10 camels, and this is Jacob himself wants to get married. Who knows what awaits me? Then he tells him everything. And the next verse is very striking, important verse. They're all important, but Vayomer lo Lavan. Lavan says in verse 14, Achatzmi u'b'sari ata. Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. That's an interesting verse for our purposes. Lavan said to him, it is the case. Here they translate, so it's truly, you are my bone and flesh. He stayed with him for a month's time. Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. You are my bone and flesh. Atzmi u'b'sari. Now the term atzmi u'b'sari we have encountered earlier in the Chumash. Where do we have the term atzmi u'b'sari?
Adam and Chava.
Yes, of course we have it when the woman is created from the man, the Isha is created from the Ish, and all the other animals were brought first to Adam. He names them, but he couldn't find an Ezer, couldn't find a helper, a partner, a soulmate, couldn't find that. When it comes to when it's taken from himself, it's part of himself. Says Adam in a very excited way, Zotapam, this time is different, Zotapam. Etzem meyat samai ubasa mibsari, v'zot yikarei isha. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. The zot, for this one, I would call it Isha. Why? Ki me ish lukacha zot, because this one came from the Ish. He calls himself an Ish. To that point, he's not Ish. He becomes Ish when he names the Isha. And 3 times the word is zot. Zot, 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 this one. This is the right one. And now we have Lavan saying to Yaakov, recalling for us, of course, remember, it's a story about marriage over here. Recalling that first Ish v'Isha story. So what does it mean to say, Ach atzmi u'b'sari ata? You are my bone and flesh. And here, when it comes to Lavan, in the story over here, we have, I think, the right, maybe the obligation to be a bit cynical. What he's saying is something else here. In retrospect, when you read the story, the relationship Lavan is saying, in effect, is between me and you. Lavan is not going to see the relationship as a relationship between Yaakov and Yaakov's Ezer Kenegdo. That's not Lavan. The relationship Lavan cares about is about Jacob and Lavan. That's what he cares about. It's not the woman. In the first story, the woman is bone and flesh, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, zot. But in the story over here, as we will see, it's never about Rachel or about Leah, who themselves will say later, our father buys and sells us. No, it's about me, says Laban. That's number one. So we don't know yet what to anticipate if we never read it, but it's going to be all about Laban's relationship to Yaakov. And the second is the word ach. Ach, it is true that you are my flesh and bone, means you can see the disappointment over here. I thought we have some billionaire coming to my house, and instead I got some fugitive who's penniless. It's the last thing I need, another mouth to feed. And Jacob stays with him for a month. Remember, he came there initially for a few days. Oh, he doesn't know how long he's going to be there. He didn't come to work. Why should he? He's coming to his uncle's house to see if he can marry his own cousin. Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. He stayed with him for a month. And then we have Lavan speaking in the next pasuk. Vayomer Lavan v'Yaakov, hachi achi ata v'avadtani chinam. Because you're my brother, my relative, you should work for me for nothing. Hagida li ma maskretelcha. Tell me, what wages do you want? That's a wonderful Lavan verse, for the simple reason that the Chumash never intimated in the slightest that Yaakov intends to work. Where do you see working? It says, Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. Why would he work anyway? He's going to his uncle's house. Because you're my brother, because you're my relative, you should work for nothing? Tell me, how much should I pay you? Ma maskretecha. Let me translate that into our language. Don't think of our relationship as uncle and nephew. Think of it as employer and employee. And tell me, what should I pay you? Not we pay X amount per hour. What do you want for the work you're going to do? Ma maskretecha. And here is Jacob's first test in the house of Lavan. Here's what Jacob, I think, should have said. My beloved uncle, I didn't really come here to work, I'll tell you the truth. I came here because I'm in trouble. And I thought as my relative, you would protect me and take me in. And yes, it's true. I also came to find a wife. In fact, I met your beautiful daughter at the well. I really love her, and I'm very interested in her. Now, if you need a worker, if you don't want me to stay here, so I'll go someplace else. I don't want our relationship to be any way related to wages and to work, because it's not about that. Let's keep it on the level of family, keep it on the level of good deeds towards the other, no matter who the other is. But in this case, it's family. And that's the way, I'm your sister's son. So there's no working over here. That's what he should have said. That's not what he does say. He says something very different. He falls exactly into the trap. And the trap, of course, is set by Lavan. And now the Torah says, Ulavan shtei banot, Shem Agdola Leah, v'Shem Haktana Rachel. So now we discover that Rachel is the younger daughter. The older one is Leah, and the younger one is Rachel. V'Einei Leah Rakot. Rachel's eyes were Rakot, whatever that means, literally soft. Leave that out. So there's some problem with the eyes. For Rachel Haita, but by contrast, Rachel Haita Yifator Bifat Mareh. Rachel is very beautiful. Rachel is beautiful, looks beautiful. The Torah didn't say that initially when Yaakov meets Rachel, but now we're told that. And he kissed Rachel when he first met her. So Yaakov says, "Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel." Jacob loved Rachel. Vayomer Evodcha Sheva Shanim Barachel Bitcha Haktana. And Jacob said, "I worked for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." He actually spells it out. The Midrashim and the commentaries think he was a bit suspicious. Maybe he knows that normally speaking, the younger one doesn't get married before the older one. So he says very explicitly, "I'll work for you for 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel." Your daughter, whose name is Rachel, and she's younger. So don't play any games with me. Don't say a different Rachel. Don't say someone else. Whatever. Don't say anything. Rachel, the younger daughter. Says Lavan, Vayomer Lavan, Tov titi otalach, mititi otala ish acher, shvai madi. Now Lavan comes with a wonderful Lavan statement in verse number 19. Then I have a few things to say about this, and I'll take the comments and questions. And Lavan said, "I'd rather give it to you than anybody else." That's a Lavan statement. He didn't say yes. Nobody else will get her. Here's the thing about Lavan. You can never pin a lie on Lavan. He's the biggest liar that ever existed. But he doesn't actually, technically speaking, ever lie. Or you can't prove that he lies. He didn't say yes. He said the truth. No one else will marry her, which is true. No one else will marry her. But it may take a little longer than 7 years. Or to put it this way, you may get her after 7 years, but I'm going to extract more labor than 7 years. He manages through his rules to extract 7 years for the first wife, not Rachel, and 7 years for the second wife. But he didn't lie. "I'd rather give it to you than anybody else. Shvai Madi, you stay with me." Shvai Madi is a way of saying the first by Yeshev imo chodesh yamim. He stayed with him, he wasn't working. But over here, of course, he will manage to extract not only 7 years of labor from Yaakov, but 14 years. And it's funny, Lavan said to Yaakov, "Because you're my relative, you should work for nothing." And after 14 years, Yaakov has 2 wives and 2 handmaidens, and he has 0 money, actually. One might say, but he does have his, what they say in Yiddish, kahak tzaros. Literally tzarot. He's got a family which basically doesn't get along with each other, etc., etc. So I would say, you shouldn't work for nothing. Yaakov says, but I'm working for less than nothing. I'm working not just for no money, but on top of that, I have major problems with this family, with all because of the way you set it up, and we'll get to that. Yaakov is now stuck with a family that has 2 sides to the family that don't seem to get along very well, one side with the other. And this will be true in all of the Yaakov stories. Something Yaakov has to figure out how to overcome, which eventually he does do a pretty good job. That's eventually. But the story of Sefer Bereshit is largely about this family and the internal strife and the internal misbehavior of one towards the other. So here's the point over here. Yaakov has fallen into the trap. He fell into the trap. What are your wages? And now it turns out that his wives are the wages. His wives are the wages. So what Lavan has managed to do, of course, is to create a scenario in which this idea of family on one hand and work on the other, business on the other, are so incredibly interwoven with each other, nothing good will come of it. And let me make one final comment about how this plays out in the story. It plays out in more than one way, but I'll just say the obvious. The obvious is the following, and we'll get to this, we'll go back to this next week, but in the story, as we all know, so Leah, he's married to Leah and to Rachel. We'll talk about that. He's married to both. We'll discuss it next week. So Leah has 4 children right away. Immediately she has 4 children. Rachel has no children. And Rachel becomes jealous of Leah. That's the beginning of chapter 30. So Rachel wants to have children. So one way in which she, so it's complicated, she does a couple of different things. We'll discuss that next time. But one thing she does is the following. There's a story in chapter 30, beginning in verse 14. Reuven, he's the oldest son of Leah, goes out to the field and he discovers dudaim, which is typically translated as mandrakes. Mandrakes are let's call them a fertility pill. That's what they are. Mandrakes is a fertility pill. He brings them to his mother Leah. The 2 sisters are fighting for Jacob's affection, who has more children. So Rachel goes to Leah and says to Leah, give me some of the dudaim of your son. Give me some of the mandrakes of your son. Leah says, you've taken my husband, she says. We'll get to this next time. You've taken my husband. You want the mandrakes also? No, he loves you more than he loves me. We'll get to why she calls it my husband. That's very interesting. He loves you more than he loves me. I'm the mother of his children. This doesn't seem right. You want everything? You want to be both his lover and the mother of his children? So Rachel says to Leah, so we have a deal. You can sleep with him tonight. I sleep with him tonight, but tonight you can take my place. And not just tonight. On a regular basis, you sleep with him more times, you have more kids, and I get the mandrakes. Fine. And they make that deal between them. The 2 sisters have to make a deal. I'm not making this up. It's in the Chumash. Okay? I didn't make anything up. The Chumash says. Torah says the following. It came to pass at night, Leah went out to Yaakov. Let's find that verse. That is, where's that verse? Where is that verse? Here it is. Vayavo, let's see, where is this? Vayavo Yaakov ben Asodeh ba'erev, chapter 30, verse 16. Jake came back from the field towards evening. Vatetzei Leah likvato. Leah went out to greet him. Vatomer elai tavo. You come to me, she said. I have rented you out tonight with the mandrakes of my son. It's a very interesting verse. Of course, it reminds us obviously of Vayavo Esav min hasadeh b'hu ayev, Esav coming back from the field and tired, and Yaakov taking advantage. And over here, you have Leah goes out to greet Jacob and says, tonight you come to me. I've rented you out for the night. Rent a husband. Rashi tries to put, of course, the best possible face on it. They want to build up the shiftei yod, all that business. Here's the point. It's a family in which human beings are bought and sold. It's very simple. And there is no other way to read that. Sachar secharticha. And it goes back to what Lavan said. Tell me, ma maskortecha, what are your wages? My wages? This woman. The rights to Rachel, those are my wages. Oh, you remain after my own heart. You stay with me. I won't get, no one else will get her. Jacob, no one else is going to get her. Every word out of Lavan is slippery, you know. No one else will get her, right? But the point is, it's infected the family in the deepest way. That the 2 sisters conspire with each other. They're trading him off. And tonight you come to me because I rented you out for the night, you know. And by the way, it's clear it's not just that night either, because they have an ongoing relationship until they get the match, until we run out of mandrakes. This is my point about the story. Pashas Vayetze. It's a brutal story, actually. Despite Rashi's attempts to put a gloss on it, it is a brutal story. It's a complicated story. It's what people do out of desperation. It's what people do who feel that they want to be able to find their place. That's what it's about. At the center of the story, our hero is Yaakov, and Yaakov hopefully will emerge from all this a very different person. He will be transformed. I would say more, he will transform himself. But this is the beginning of the story. And this is what the Torah presents us with, is a very, very complicated story about our hero. We know where he's come from. We know he aspires to lofty things. His dreams are about angels ascending and descending to heaven. So we are very interested in seeing how this will all play out. And all this time, he has this commitment that he made. He took a vow. I'm going to serve God in a different way. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to build a family in which every member of my family can be included. It's never happened to this point, never. And that's Yaakov's dream, to build an inclusive structure. The problem is he's trying to build an inclusive structure, but the context of the way he builds the family is one that lends itself not to unity, but to a very profound disunity. So we'll have to see how this plays out in the coming weeks. Okay, I'll stop at this point. If anybody has comments, questions, or whatever, please, let's hear. There was several.
One moment, Laszlo. I saw you had your hand up for a bit.
Yes.
Okay, unmute.
Sorry.
Yes, just to underline the point that you made earlier about the difference in character between Rivka and Rachel. When the Torah mentions first their meeting, we are told the meeting between Yitzchak and Rivka from the point of view of Rivka. Says, and she saw him and she fell. And when this meeting, the one we are reading now, it's from a different point of view. It's only from Yaakov's point of view that he saw her. She doesn't do anything. She's not active in approaching him.
Yes, good point. That's a very good point. But the Torah doesn't say, there's nothing at this point negative about Rachel. I'm not saying negative. I'm saying that there's nothing positive either. He does what she did in the previous story. That's all.
Is it possible to say that this is part of the process of winnowing out the Charan from the family? In other words, Rivka too has an aspect of Charan and the deceiving component, and that in order to build a true family, you can't have the relationships as transactional or business, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But this is a theme. You almost have to get the Lavan out of Yaakov, because Lavan is part of Yaakov, and he is in many ways like Yaakov is in many ways like Lavan.
Right.
It's in his essence, and that almost is this tragic process of how do you. Now, I may have learned that from you.
Well, when I say this, I think, Chaim, actually, the point is, I think, a very central point. One question one can ask is, in other words, is there any place at all for some of these qualities to reside in everybody? In other words, to be a complete innocent. In other words, Lavan is very crooked and it's all trans and all that. The question, it comes up in that Thursday class that we started with the Nachash. In other words, is there a place for the Nachash in this world, is the question. Because to be a complete tamim, you know what I mean, innocent, is that the way one can one function in the world, is one is completely innocent? Or is there some place for some kind of cleverness, not that it necessarily overshadows the rest, but is there a place at all for the Nachash in this world? I think you're the one that raised that question. That's a very basic question. But I do agree with you, exactly everything you said. I may have said it myself at some point, that yes, the Lavan, Rivka is Lavan's sister. Yaakov, we know Yaakov's behavior before we even think of Lavan. And not just Yaakov's behavior, it runs through the whole book, basically, from the very beginning. When Adam says, the woman you put by my side, she made me do it, that's also not true. In other words, it's not just he's making an excuse. The excuses are not true in the sense that the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's true. What he says is true, but it's not true in the sense that actually is a justification. So when it comes to truth and falsehood, the point that I'm making here, and it's also for the Thursday class about the snake, Lavan Torah calls Lavan a menachesh, from the word nachash. And the point is that there are different ways to lie. My point about Lavan, which I think is an important point, is that you can say technically he doesn't lie, but he's the biggest liar who ever existed. I mean, it doesn't matter if he technically says the words, I didn't lie to you, but it is a lie. It's not true. It's not dealing with someone in an honest way, in a respectful way. That's what it means to be a liar. So the point is, it's not taking responsibility for what I say, etc., etc. It's twisting the truth. It's giving a bad interpretation of the truth. And I think for the Chumash, that is problematic. And that's why the Chumash places such a tremendous emphasis on something like confession. Because confession means I accept responsibility. And I think the idea of prayer, another one of my classes, prayer is actually about, it's about being in a space where you can actually tell 100% that you can't lie to God. We can lie to each other, but you stand before the all-knowing God, there's no point to lie. So you can actually tell the truth without, you're not worried because God knows anyway. So you really, and then the question is, does prayer carry over to the rest of our lives or not? But that's the question. So yes, I think that why this story, I think, is one that is very tough. It's a very difficult story. It's tough. I mean, it's hard to read this. I mean, let's leave the apologetics out, but I think it's an incredibly important story because it's about how someone can actually change and what's necessary and the difficulty we have in making any real change. There's so many obstacles. So part of it is seeing the consequences of this kind of behavior. You know, it's not just some kind of theoretical idea. Over here, Yaakov is going to be, in this case, he's the victim of all these machinations, of the double talk, et cetera, But you're right, it infects Haran generally. It's not just Lavan. As I said, it affected his own family. You come to me tonight, I have rented you out. That's transactional. I mean, you've rented me out. And Yaakov says nothing, by the way. It's very striking. Yaakov says not a word. Doesn't say anything. In fact, one thing that marks the story, and I'll stop with this, is he doesn't say anything at all, actually. There are 12 children born in this story. He doesn't name one of them. Not one. He's completely silent. Maybe that's also part of being in exile, feeling oneself unempowered. So that's, but we'll get to this next week. We'll just continue through the story. One last comment?
Shmuel
Yes.
Blumberg.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, this raises the important question of what's the business of Abraham, etc., going back to his family.
Right. So I would say two things about that. But let me just answer you. Okay, I'll say one thing at this point. The important point about Abraham, first let me say two things, okay? Number one, when Abraham says go back to Aram, Isaac can't marry a Canaanite woman, go back to he never says family, by the way. When he speaks to the servant, and you can check this out for yourself, says go back to my land. He doesn't say go back to the servant says family. Avram never said family. And
That makes
the main
sense.
point is that for Abraham, Canaan is worse, but the main point for Abraham is that the right person is the person who's willing to leave her family the way I left. It's more about leaving than about taking for the family. Actually, it doesn't mention the family at all. Go back to my homeland, and there's a chance somebody in that homeland, like me, will be willing to leave, which is what happens in the story. It's Rebecca who says at the end, Eilech. The reader knows it's going to end up that way. Even though he negotiates with the family the entire time, at the end of the day was Rivka's choice. Will you go? Vatomer Eilech. So for Abraham, it's largely about leaving. Now, that I think is the core answer. There's another piece to it, because I don't think you're wrong, actually. I do think there's something about the family at that point that is significant. Maybe we'll revisit that in the future. But yeah, but better than the Canaanites, true. Okay, we'll stop at this point then. We'll be continuing next week with the story of Yaakov in the house of Laban. Gets even more complicated, but we'll see. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, Kayla, you want to make an announcement?
Yes, we have a new class starting tonight at 8 p.m. with Rabbi Shlomo Zukir on top called Contemporary Shemitah, Challenges, Compliance, Relevance, and Rebirth. If you are interested, you can sign up online at drisha.org/classes. And And we have a full class schedule this week. You are welcome to join any. If you had any questions that we were not able to get to in class, you are welcome to send them to Rabbi Silber by email at bsilber@drisha.org.